Welcome to the Fall Quarter DRMA Lecture. Dr. Brian Strayer is with us today, and he's going to talk about Jansenism, its key figures, themes, and relevance today. You'll notice a couple of papers. One is the evaluation for the event. The other one is a list of key terms and figures. So you might want to have that handy. I didn't introduce myself. Scott Kelly, Office of Mission and Values. Just a little bit about Dr. Strayer's background. He earned a Ph.D. in history from the University of Iowa in 1987. He's taught a number of courses at the graduate and undergraduate level in early modern European social, cultural, intellectual history, French history, and Seventh-day Adventist history. He's written 7 books, 4 in French history and 3 in Seventh-day Adventist history. One of the books that he wrote is Suffering Saints, Jansenists, and Convulsionaires in France, 1640 to 1790. And that's this little icon that you probably can't read, but I'm happy to send you the information about that. And this is the text right here that's also out in paperback. He's published a number of articles. And one of his books that I wanted to show out, I found, we discussed today. This is a collection of over 30 years of Blue Book bloopers. And he went and added footnotes to these to explain many of his student responses. So this is available also on Kindle. Just a brief bit of context about Jansenism. Many of you know why this is significant, or in case you don't, towards the end of Vincent de Paul's life, he wrote a number of letters about Jansenism. 2 quotes that I wanted to read. One was from a Jansenist historian who says, Vincent de Paul was one of the most dangerous enemies that the disciples of St. Augustine, Jansenists, have ever encountered. Another quote from a theologian of the Sorbonne, just as God had raised up St. Ignatius against Luther and Calvin, so did he raise up Monsieur Vincent against Jansenism. This is a face of Vincent that's not often seen. He was, in some estimation, a considerable theologian, and this controversy, this Jansenist controversy, is a significant part of the Vincentian story. So that's why today is good to put some of this in context. So with that, thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Professor Kelly, Religions Department faculty, all of you for coming. I was just saying to Professor Kelly that I noticed the line there on your evaluation sheet that involved the words, "It was a complete waste of time." And if that does occur to you, we can go over to the Romans and their aqueducts, flash of an eye here, because that has certainly amused me over the years. But I am delighted to be here. Very pleasant drive from southwestern Michigan, where we're enjoying peaches and apples and pears of many varieties. It's a great fruit belt. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Jansenism was a jigsaw puzzle whose variegated pieces reflected the different personalities, ideals, and conflicts of a broad spectrum of individuals. In the next 40 minutes, I would like to share with you briefly 14 of those individuals who were either proponents of Jansenism or influenced it in some positive or negative way, 10 of its major ideals, and then close with some reflections, personal reflections about its meaning for us today. Michel Bias, a professor of theology at the University of Louvain in modern Belgium, prepared the soil in which Jansenism sprouted and grew. Studying the Bible and patristic sources in their original languages without filtering them through the lens of scholasticism, he emphasized an Augustinian view of sanctifying grace, perfect union with God, and moral living. Like St. Augustine, he saw humans who lacked free wills as incapable of overcoming the corruption of original sin by their own efforts, apart from God's grace. Bias's writings would be read by the University of Louvain professor Jacques Janson, who in turn would teach them to his disciple, Cornelius Jansenis. Louis de Molina, a Spanish Jesuit professor, promoted the idea that God's sufficient grace became efficacious for salvation only with the individual's consent. In his 1588 work, The Reconciliation of Free Will with Free Grace, he posited a middle way, called Molinism, between Bionism and traditional Catholicism by asserting that while God's grace is sufficient to save everyone, not everybody will accept it. In short, humans can resist God's grace. The fact that the Society of Jesus adopted this Molinist position automatically made them persona non grata among all Jansenists. Edmond Richer, trained by Jesuits in logic and philosophy at Hainaut, earned master's and doctor's degrees in theology at the Sorbonne. In his 1611 book, Ecclesiastical and Political Power, Richer argued that the French kings, sovereign by divine right, are independent of all other authority, including that of popes. While the church has spiritual authority to cure souls, it has no power to constrain the state because kings appoint bishops in the Gallican or French church, where real power rests with bishops, archbishops, and cardinals assembling in general councils which are superior to popes. This potent blend of political Gallicanism and ecclesiastical Richerism likewise prepared the soil for Jansenism, since Jansenists never accepted the infallibility of the Pope, denied papal authority over kings, and refused to adopt the Holy See's pompous Baroque style. In France, Jansenists advanced a tripartite Gallicanism: episcopal, royal, and parliamentary. In the 18th century, Gallicanism would be the glue that fused Richerism and Jansenism together in Parlement's resistance to the absolutism of Louis XIV and Louis XV. Cornelius Jansenius of Holland earned a doctoral degree at the University of Louvain and rose through the ranks to become faculty regent and Bishop of Ypres. A controversial writer, his book Mars Gallicus, 1635, attacked Richelieu's policies during the 30 Years' War, while his Augustinus in 1640 caused a hurricane of controversy across Europe for its defense of St. Augustine and its attacks on the Pelagians, Molinists, and Jesuits, arguing that St. Augustine's thought was the touchstone of orthodoxy and not merely a privileged reference point, as many Catholic theologians saw it. Its 1,300 pages, which is quite a slog through, it's all in Latin, present an Augustinian view of grace, sin, human will, salvation, and predestination. Since Adam's original sin had deprived him of God's sufficient grace to live a sinless life, the only way humans could overcome sin was by accepting God's efficacious grace. In the 1653 bull Cum Occasione, Pope Innocent X condemned 5 propositions he found in the Augustinus as heretical. Sebastian Zamet, already famous as a Tridentine reformer of the Cistercian order at Tarbes in France, spearheaded further changes at Port-Royal in the 1630s when he persuaded its abbess, Angelique Arno, to transfer jurisdiction from the Cistercian order to his newly established Institute of the Holy Sacrament, which followed the Augustinian rule. He then created the Daughters of the Blessed Sacrament to unify the sisters at Port-Royal with those at Tarbes. A man of Baroque spirituality, Zamet loved incense, floral bouquets, perfumed rooms, splendid linens, refined manners, and majestic music, the very lifestyle rejected by the ascetic Mère Angelique herself, who saw these measures as compromises. In a negative sense, then, Zamet promoted Jansenism by driving the abbess into the arms of the Abbé de Saint-Cyran. The Abbé de Saint-Cyran, who earned degrees in philosophy and theology at 3 Jesuit universities in France, became Queen Anne's royal almoner, the Bishop of Bayonne, and a key figure in establishing the Petite École, the Jansenist schools at Port Royal, for which he wrote the textbook Familiar Theology in 1643. Its rigorous theology reflects his Augustinian views on grace, confirmation, confession, and communion. In it, he promotes a strict observance of the Eucharist, confession, and fast. In his sermons, he emphasized contrition rather than attrition, love of God's immutable rules, charity toward the poor, and suffering as the beginning of the Christian's life. His combative style in opposing Jesuit casuistry, however, earned him many enemies, including Richelieu, who imprisoned him at the Chateau of Vincennes for 6 years. As Mère Angelique's confessor, Saint-Cyran imposed upon the sisters at Port Royal a more ascetic lifestyle, including more frequent confessions, voluntary privations, and increased penitence. When Saint-Cyran died, his nephew, Martin de Barcos, became the next Abbé de Saint-Cyran and spiritual director of Port Royal, thus proving that even Jansenists could embrace nepotism. Rigidly anti-Thomistic and anti-Cartesian, he required even greater submission and deeper penitence of the sisters there. However, despite his being a strong advocate of silence and solitude for the female religious, he himself spoke and wrote boldly in support of Antoine Arnaud's battle within the church over the issue of droit, or right, and fait, or fact, in Jansen's book Augustinus. Antoine the Great, Arnaud, earned a doctorate in theology at the Sorbonne, accepted spiritual guidance from Saint-Cyran, and became Port Royal's defense attorney. A leading controversialist, his bold approach to conflict quickly earned him the enmity of the Jesuits, the French court, the Holy See, the Archbishop of Paris, and Louis XIV. Arnaud advised his sister, Angelique, and the Port Royal community not to sign the formulary, but instead to maintain a respectful silence concerning it. An outstanding writer, his 3 most famous works include the first and second Apologies for Jansenius, 1644 and 45, and the Frequent Communion of 1641. His legalistic mind devised the hair-splitting distinction between recognizing the Pope's right, or droit, to condemn as heretical the 5 propositions, while denying in fact that those propositions existed in Jansen's work Augustinus. Expelled from the Sorbonne in 1656, he accepted the protection of his sister Angelique at Port Royal des Champs. There he fired off volleys of prose defending Gallican liberties, attacking papal infallibility, and charging the Jesuits with waging a conspiracy against innocent Jansenists. His writings condemn the Society of Jesus for promoting laxism, casuistry, and attrition rather than contrition for one's sins. His motto might be summarized thus: pray often, confess often, do penitence often, fast often, weep often, give alms often, but take communion infrequently. Robert Arnaud d'Andilly, an intendant in the King's army during the 30 Years' War, relinquished that position in 1637 and retreated to Port Royal des Champs to live the life of a solitaire. A fearless ambassador at large for Port Royal at court, he wrote 80 letters and several books praising the lifestyles of the solitaire and the nuns and defending any Jansenist under attack by church or government officials. Although Mazarin banished him to his estate at Pomponne, Robert continued defending himself and his Jansenist friends to the day he died at the age of 85. Pierre Nicole, although a robe noble trained by the Jesuits, became a close friend of the Arno family. He collaborated with Antoine Arno in writing the powerful Apology for the Religious of Port Royal in 1665. 3 years later, Nicole penned the clarification of several difficulties of the religious of Port Royal concerning the signing of the formulary in 1668, showcasing the solitaire's good deeds and their pure motives. In 1670, he published his famous treatise on the education of a prince, a 77-page manifesto for Christian education that established the blueprint for the little schools, or petit école, at Port Royal. Indeed, for many years, Nicole taught philosophy and the humanities at the Petite École in Paris. Finally, his magnum opus, a 600-page treatise on prayer, published posthumously in 1714, argued that silent prayer, what he called thinking good thoughts, was as effective as spoken prayer. To support his point, he cited examples from the lives of the saints since apostolic times. Pasquier-Canal, like Nicole, had been trained by the Jesuits and signed the formulary as a young priest in 1659. But when the Archbishop of Paris condemned his book, Moral Reflections on the New Testament, published in 1692, he fled France and found refuge in Holland and Brussels from 1685 to 1703. Refusing to remain silent, he penned some 4,000 letters and several polemical works defending himself, attacking the bull Unigenitus, 1713, and protecting his Jansenist friends. His two most famous works, Christian Instructions in 1671 and Moral Reflections, 1692, both devotional bestsellers, precipitated a division within the church, but ignited the flame of the second wave of Jansenism. A potent blend of Richerism, Gallicanism, Conciliarism, and Jansenism, these books won him enemies in Rome and France. In the bull Unigenitus, Clement XI condemned 101 propositions allegedly found in Moral Reflections. In addition, by highlighting the prophetic role Canal expected the Jews to play in last-day events by their conversion and restoration to Israel, he introduced the element of figurism that would become prominent in 18th century Jansenism and the convulsionary movement. In time, Canalisme would permeate the pages of the underground Jansenist newspaper, the Ecclesiastical News. Blaise Pascal's family frequently attended services at Port Royal in the 1640s. His sister Jacqueline entered the convent in 1652. His nephew Etienne Perrier studied at the Petite École, and his niece Marguerite Perrier experienced miraculous healing there after her face was touched by the holy thorn in 1656. In a private cell at Port Royal des Champs, Blaise composed his famous 19 provincial letters in 1656 and 7, defending Jansenism and attacking the Jesuits. A writer and mathematician, Pascal's genius was to apply the rigor of geometrical reasoning to the principles of Augustinian theology in these letters. Although this work aroused against him the hatred of the Jesuits, the Sorbonne theologians, Louis XIV, and Popes Innocent X and Alexander VII, it did in fact give Jansenism a shot in the arm that it needed and won many converts to Jansenist morality. Over the past 200 years, Antoine Arnaud exclaimed in 1694, there has been no book as widely known and read around the world in French or in Latin as the Provincial Letters. Jean-Baptiste Racine entered Port Royal in 1642 at the tender age of 3, shortly after his mother died. In the little schools there, he studied grammar and literature. His love for poetry and Greek tragedy bore fruit in his famous dramas Esther and Athaliah. Despite Racine's ties to Port Royal, Louis XIV invited him to visit Versailles and awarded him a pension of 4,000 livres. In 1695, Racine wrote an abridged history of Port Royal, a powerful defense of the principles and individuals who had made that community a beacon of Jansenism for half a century. He was probably the only Jansenist who regularly corresponded with Louis XIV, his mistress, Madame de Maintenon, his confessor, Père Lachaise, and the poet Boileau, not to mention a host of princes, dukes, ambassadors, and military figures. In a word, he brought respectability and savoir-faire to Jansenism in the late 17th century. Angelique Arno, the sister of Antoine Arnaud, began life as an unruly, rich, rambunctious brat who resented being sent to Port Royal des Champs at the age of 8. Appointed abbess at 15, she experienced a sincere conversion at 17. In 1609, she placed the abbey under strict seclusion. She increased the frequency of prayers, she ordered the sisters to relinquish their personal possessions, and she instituted a regimen of fasting, manual labor, poverty, charity to the poor, and silence. By 1661, 164 nuns, novices, and postulants resided at the 2 abbeys of Port Royal. Despite suffering from dropsy, severe headaches, heart problems, and insomnia, Angelique transformed Port Royal into a Jansenist stronghold powerful enough to withstand the attacks of royal ministers like Richelieu and Mazarin, and popes like Innocent X and Alexander VII. Her political connections, her 800 letters, speeches, books, petitions, and memoirs, and her nuns' many clever methods of passive resistance kept the abbey, the grange where the male solitaires lived, and the petite école intact for more than a century. In my recent book, Suffering Saints, I have emphasized several major themes which, like golden threads, I see permeating the movement from its beginning in 1640 to the 1790s. The first theme is that of suffering. True to their Benedictine roots and Cistercian heritage, Jansenists adopted ascetic lifestyles, praised self-denial in others, expressed courage amidst persecution, and found comfort in hard labor and severe penance. Following the guidelines laid down by St. Augustine, St. Jerome, John Cassian, and St. Benedict's rule, they embraced fasting, poverty, chastity, veiling for women, severe penance, long prayers, and minute self-examination. Their opposition to church and state policies often brought them persecution. But Jansenists, like the first century martyrs they imagined themselves to be, welcomed their suffering, finding contentment in pain, glory in affliction, and hope in injustice as God's faithful witnesses for the truth. Saintliness. Although church officials considered Jansenists to be, at best, schismatic and at worst, heretical, Jansenists saw themselves as true Catholics who followed the teachings of the great church father St. Augustine. To them, Augustinianism, with its emphasis on man's original sin, God's efficacious grace, weak human willpower, and strict morality, had been the essence of Catholic orthodoxy for more than 1,300 years. Living as God's true saints meant embracing severe fasts, long prayers, solitude, self-examination, silence, and infrequent participation in communion. By the 17th and 18th centuries, however, Jansenists also advocated the Mass in the vernacular, placed a strong emphasis on Scripture and a new focus on the cross, and adopted a triple solitude. First, isolation from the world within walled enclosures. Second, isolation from one another in tiny rooms. Third, taking the vow of silence to prepare oneself for what they called the good death, the death of a saint in defense of the truth. Truth, one of the key words that pops up in all Jansenist writings, private and public, is that word verite. Jansenists saw themselves as defenders of certain doctrines, such as efficacious grace, long neglected by the church. Although at times suppressed, truth would in the end triumph, they felt, over falsehood, if strong, independent-minded proponents, whom they called the friends of the truth, defended it. The search for truth inspired their little schools and motivated them to write reams of letters, tracts, and books. For as Angelique Arno declared, it is necessary to repulse with force and vigor that which is said with such insolence against the truth. In their ongoing battle with popes and kings over the formulary, Jansenists put conscience above submission. Indeed, in 1661, Blaise Pascal's sister, Jacqueline, a nun at Port Royal, exclaimed that the time had now come for all of us to die for the truth. Gallicanism, Richerism, conciliarism. Jansenists never accepted the infallibility of popes and denied papal power over kings and bishops. Instead, they espoused a triple Gallicanism: episcopal, the bishops to be independent of kings and popes; royal, kings to be independent of the popes; and parliamentary, the Parlement to be free from Rome's domination. As disciples of Edmond Richer, they asserted that French kings, sovereign by divine right, were independent of papal authority. In the church, real power rested with what they called the body of pastors, the bishops, the archbishops, the cardinals, meeting in general councils. As confirmed conciliarists, they favored appeals to church councils rather than ultramontane appeals to the Pope. Gallicanism, Richerism, and conciliarism were the three sides of the Jansenist political triangle. Church-state conflicts. In France, at least, church and state had been intertwined for more than 1,300 years. So the Jansenist outspoken defense of conciliarism, Gallicanism, and Richerism embroiled them in controversies with both religious and political authorities. They crossed swords with popes on several fronts: their opposition to papal infallibility, their exaltation of church councils, and their promotion of Augustinian over Thomistic theology. Likewise, they clashed with several of the archbishops of Paris over their refusal to sign the formulary and their hair-splitting distinction between right and fact. They made enemies of the Jesuits by disagreeing with their Molinist position on sufficient grace and free will, attacking their lax morality and casuistry, ridiculing their love of hierarchical authority, and questioning their missionaries' orthodoxy in China, Japan. They clashed with the General Assembly of the Gallican clergy, whose definitions of heresy and church reform often differed from their own. They found themselves out of favor at court because Louis XIV saw them as a cabal against government authority, rebels whose so-called republicanism clashed with his firm belief in divine right rule. Contradictions and paradoxes. Even the Abbé de Saint-Cyran admitted that he had a celestial temperament, composed of fire and ice, which made him sometimes self-contradictory. At times, it seems, even Jansenists could be hypocritical. Their temporary liaison with the Cardinal de Retz during the Fronde, 1648 to 53, represented a significant departure from their creed of rejecting the world. Their behavior caused Louis XIV and Mazarin to consider them frondeurs, or rebels, and it tarnished their public image for generations. The cloistered sisters and the isolated Monsieur at Port-Royal des Champs illustrate another paradox. Although they lived ascetic lives, they were not required to take monastic vows, they did not have to attend Mass, and in an era that considered manual labor disreputable for the upper class and nobly born, they grew fruit and vegetables and milked cows in between their reading of the Bible and translating theological works. Internal diversity. These paradoxes arose within Jansenism in part, I think, because of the tremendous spectrum of diversity within its ranks. Liberals like Robert Arnaud d'Andilly, who sympathized with Jansenism but did not adopt its ascetic lifestyle, made accommodations to secular society because they wanted to advance within it. Moderates like Antoine Arnaud and Pierre Nicole sought a balance between compliance to authority and a demand for justice by creating for themselves a more restricted sphere within the world. Ascetics like Saint-Cyran, Martin Barcos, Angelique Arno lived lives of self-denial, either at home or at Port-Royal, rejecting everything they considered as worldly. Extremists like Jacqueline Pascal, William Leroy, who made no concessions to church or state authority, proclaimed goodness and evil in a wicked world that they expected would persecute them. Finally, the 18th century witnessed the bizarre behavior of the fanatical convulsionaires, whose allegorical dreams, healing miracles, and sadomasochistic secours, or tortures, gave Jansenism a black eye during the Enlightenment, when the philosophes, with the exception of Voltaire's older brother, advocated throwing the Jansenist baby out with the Catholic bathwater. Political thought and action. Because so many of their theological positions had social, economic, and political ramifications, the Jansenists found themselves drawn into secular debates and controversies. As previously mentioned, their involvement with the Cardinal de Retz, who used them shamelessly during the Fronde, got them branded as rebels against the king in the 1650s. Controversies over the Regale, the Formulary, and the Four Gallican Articles in the 1670s and 80s helped shape the politics of Port-Royal and taught the Jansenists how to balance Gallican liberties with papal power so that conciliarism could check ultramontanism to their own advantage. Finally, while they never openly attacked the monarchy, many of their religious, political, and social ideals, including their fraternal, egalitarian ideal of society and their democratic congregational polity, subverted many of the cherished values of the ancient regime: order, hierarchy, corporate privilege. In 1770, for example, they wrote some 80 pamphlets against the so-called despotism of Chancellor Maupeou, joining with their old enemies, including the philosophes, to overthrow this official whose reform program they saw as undermining the authority of a now Jansenist-dominated Parlement. Passive resistance. Centuries before Henry David Thoreau, Mohandas Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr. popularized their methods of civil disobedience, the Jansenists pioneered both the theory and the practice of resisting divine right authority in church and state. In 1657, Antoine Arnaud declared negative submission acceptable when legitimate authorities tried to coerce one's conscience. Such non-resistance, he declared, conserves the good order of states. Jansenists used this argument to resist papal efforts to force them to sign the formulary. At Port Royal, Antoine's sister, Mère Angelique, argued that as women, the sisters were weaker vessels, forbidden to study Latin and canon law or to engage in theological debates. Consequently, being ignorant, they should not be required to sign the formulary, whose issues they could not be expected to understand. Therefore, let church officials accept their respectful silence as a token of their submission, she said. For half a century, Port Royal's abbesses used this theology of weakness, what Daniela Castrun has called the feminist paradox, to defy what they considered the illegitimate use of authority by Louis XIV, the Pope, and the Archbishop of Paris. In so doing, they effectively combined defiance and acquiescent suffering into a balancing act of passive opposition. Adopting a tone of wounded innocence, naivete, and deep earnestness, these clever nuns used reams of paper and barrels of ink in their defense. Despite Archbishop Parafix's denunciation of them as pure as angels and proud as Lucifer, their campaign of passive resistance delayed the destruction of Port Royal des Champs for over 50 years. The growth of toleration. Despite Antoine Arnaud's self-serving advice to Prince Ernest of Hesse-Rheinfels that tolerance was the most reasonable approach rulers could take towards schismatics and heretics, 17th century Jansenists seldom tolerated those whose views differed from their own. In their writings, they attacked Protestants, Jesuits, mercantilists, ultramontanists, and Catholic bishops with equal impunity. Yet by the early 18th century, the social and intellectual milieu of the Enlightenment benefited even those who opposed the philosophes. After Louis XIV's death, the tolerant Duc d'Orléans, who was on the throne from 1715 to 1723, recalled the bishops who had been exiled for opposing the bull Unigenesis, released scores of imprisoned Jansenists, and invited hundreds of fugitive appellants to return to France. In the 1730s, Minister d'Argenson moderated government pressure on the Jansenists. Consequently, by the 1770s, many of the Jansenists themselves began to embrace popular social and political causes, such as the campaigns to expel the Jesuits, to abolish the Inquisition, and to soften the penal codes against heretics. Jansenist writers in the underground newspaper, the Ecclesiastical News, praised the Austrian Emperor Joseph II for his tolerant laws toward Lutherans and Calvinists in his realm. After 1775, they began urging Louis XVI to grant full civil and religious rights to French Protestants, Jews, and blacks. In 1787, the Jansenists supported the Edict for the Non-Catholics that restored their full citizenship. Finally, during the French Revolution, many Jansenist deputies urged the Constituent Assembly to abandon religious toleration in favor of religious liberty. After 150 years of suffering, Jansenists, it seems, had finally learned to grant others the same rights they themselves had struggled to obtain. Perhaps at this point, many of you may be thinking, so what? What possible relevance could a 300-year-old religious tempest in a teapot within the Catholic Church have for secular postmodernists today? I think that is a legitimate question, at the risk of sounding like a Jansenist in the confessional, I will try to show you the way of wisdom, as your university motto puts it, by offering you the following 3 personal applications of what I've been discussing so far. First, I think a study of Jansenism should teach each one of us how important it is from time to time to take a closer look at ourselves, who we are, why we're here, and where we're going in life. The words, "Know thyself," inscribed on the walls of Apollo's shrine at Delphi, could have served as the Jansenist aim. Well, Socrates' famous words, "The unexamined life is not worth living," could have been their motto. Almost by definition, a Jansenist was someone who, after days of fasting, prayer, and self-examination, knew every single one of their strengths and their weaknesses. The sunlit chambers of their minds where kindness, joy, and humility dwelt, and the darker recesses where selfishness, fear, and pride lurked. How about us? Do we understand who we really are in God's eyes? Do we realize why He placed us here on this earth? Do we know where the trend of our lives today will take us in the near future? Have we spent even 1 hour today in meditation and prayer, listening for God's voice? I think most Jansenists would have agreed with Ellen Harmon White, a 19th century American advocate of Christian meditation and prayer, who wrote these words, "When every other voice is hushed, and in the stillness we wait before Him, the silence in the soul makes more distinct the voice of God speaking to our conscience." When was the last time you or I turned off the TV, the cell phone, the iPod, the iPad, the BlackBerry, the surround sound stereo system for even 1 hour so that we could meditate and pray? At Pioneer Memorial Church on the campus of Andrews University, a Seventh-day Adventist institution of higher education in Southwest Michigan, where I teach history, our youth pastor recently distributed pledge cards to our college students, encouraging them to take one of 3 pledges. First, to fast from social media for 1 entire week. Or second, for 1 week to spend no more time on social media than I spend in Bible study, prayer, and meditation. Or third, to use social media to share God's love and to encourage others. A modern Jansenist would have no problem at all taking all 3 of those pledges. How about you and me? Second, the history of Jansenism, like the history of almost any minority religious group, teaches us that religious freedom is never free. Someone had to pay the price for it, and the price was often paid in blood. Well, the Jansenist persecution, which most often entailed wars of words, intermingled with a few imprisonments and some banishments now and then, never reached the bloody level of suffering endured by the Huguenots, the Camisards in France. Nonetheless, it demonstrated a lack of Christian charity and toleration toward the other. Even right here in the land of the free and the home of the brave, we are all familiar with the story of how our Puritan and Cavalier ancestors whipped, branded, banished, or killed Baptists, Quakers, Jews, Catholics, not to mention the alleged witches and wizards. Third, the willingness of the Jansenists to suffer and even die for the truth they espoused raises yet another question you and I need to think about today. Is there any truth, with a capital T, for which you would be willing to put your life on the line? Perhaps we would all be willing to die for a person, or mother, father, husband, wife, brother, sister, boyfriend, girlfriend. But what about a principle, a doctrine, or a practice so important that you would, that to give it up would violate your conscience and weaken your relationship with God? In this postmodern world where it seems that nearly everything is relative and negotiable, are there indeed some ideals that are worth dying for? Where is your line in the sand today? What are your fundamental beliefs? Like the Jansenist, if you and I know what we're willing to die for someday, then we should also know what we're willing to live for today. In closing, I want to thank Professor Scott Kelly and the Department of Religious Studies faculty for inviting a Seventh-day Adventist professor to come to a Roman Catholic university to talk about an obscure schismatic group like the Jansenists. I think that adequately demonstrates that tolerance is not in short supply on this campus. Thank you very much. Q&A time?
Sure.
All right. Questions?
Were the Jansenists ever struck by their parallels? Because essentially they were their opponents at times called them crypto-Protestants. Were they ever struck by the resonance between some of their positions and classic Calvinist positions and other insights, Protestant insights?
Yeah, particularly in the 17th century. I mean, that charge was quite prevalent in the 17th century. As I show in my book here, they had to try very hard to show that, well, you know, we really aren't, because we go to Mass. Yeah, some wise wit or half-wit, perhaps, once said that a Jansenist is really a Protestant who goes to Mass. And so they had to try to portray the differences, between them and the Protestants. Now, over time, of course, they began to see more of the parallels, not so much in doctrine and theology, but in the way they were being persecuted. And so it's sort of like, that old phrase, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And they began to say, well, we're both being picked on by the church popes and archbishops and cardinals. We're both being persecuted by the king and the court. So maybe we should make common cause here and fight back. That didn't come until the 18th century, of course, second half of the 18th century. But in the 17th century, as your question clearly implies, doctrine was more important than, social and political aspects of their life. And, I'm sure I haven't read even a tithe of the literature, but what I have read indicates that, yes, they tried very hard to show the difference in not only their doctrines and their theologies, but also in their ecclesiology and their church practices. Because, after all, there are many similarities. I mean, when they're both rooted in Augustinianism, you're going to find a lot of similar views of grace, human nature, etc. Yeah. Yes, sir?
Is Jansenist a term they would have self-identified with?
No.
What would they call themselves?
Well, friends of the truth. L'Amis de la vérité. Friends of the truth. Antoine Arnaud is the one that I would recommend for your reading on that. Constantly, he uses the term phantom. Jansenism is a phantom. You're striking out at shadows here. There is no such thing as See, Jansenism was the equivalent of, say, calling someone a Millerite here in the 19th century in America. Follow William Miller and the Millerite movement. Jansenism was obviously taken from Jansenius. And so they're saying, well, if you agree with Jansenius and the Augustinists, then you must be a Jansenist. They say, no, we're friends of the truth. If the Augustinists has truth in it, then yeah, we're gonna follow that path. But if there's anything that's not truthful, in what Jansen says, then we're still gonna follow truth. We're not gonna follow Jansen. But it was a convenient label that was applied to them. They did not apply that to themselves. Yeah. Friends of the truth. Yes, sir.
Yeah, what was the truth for the Jansenists? And also, what was the relation between St. Vincent and the Jansenists?
Between the Jansenists and who?
St. Vincent de Paul.
Oh, well, I told I told my friend I was going to refer theological questions to him because he's done the research on St. Vincent de Paul. I checked my index. I think St. Vincent de Paul comes up only 3 times in the book because, as you scholars, Vincentian scholars know, he's reaching the end of his life as Jansenism is just taking off. The Augustinus is 1640 and St. Vincent de Paul dies in, 1660, as I recall. So, he's against Jansenism for obvious Orthodox Catholic reasons, because St. Vincent de Paul is coming at his theology by way of scholasticism, and the Jansenists are bypassing scholasticism. They're reading Augustine in Latin and Greek without filtering what they read through Thomistic interpretation and thought. So just about anywhere you want to go, sir, really. The nature of man, the fall of Adam and Eve, sin, confession, frequency or infrequency of confession, just about everywhere you want to go. They're different. They're different. They
So
have a different.
what was the truth for the Jansenists?
I could be glib and say that the truth for them was just about the opposite of what the Jesuits were teaching, because by the 18th century, most people saw Jansenists as being anti-Jesuit. That's how they kind of summed them up. What the Jesuits represented, the Jansenists opposed. But in a more thoughtful response to your question, the Jansenists, and particularly the convulsionaires, I find this becoming more and more emphasized in the 18th century when the convulsionaire movement gets going. They see themselves as a reincarnation of the first century saints. They are trying to go back to original Christianity, first century, before it becomes, and this is a term they would use, encrusted with the decisions of church councils in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century. And, face it, that's another Protestant idea. Protestants see themselves as going back to represent first century apostolic Christianity, and things going kind of downhill from there. Whereas, an Orthodox Catholic with the things are going uphill from there, with church councils adding greater light, new doctrines and practices and so forth. So if you think of a Jansenist in terms of a first century martyr, that would probably be the most accurate way of pegging them. They are biblical, but pre-church councils. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Sometimes when you talk about Jansenism as a theological movement, but it is very strongly a social and political movement as well, is that
definitely.
correct?
Definitely. It becomes more and more so in the 18th century, particularly 1730s and onwards, when more and more Jansenist educated lawyers and magistrates, and there were several colleges, I don't remember the names of them all now, they're in my book, that were known to be centers of Jansenist legal thought. As more and more of those men got into Parlement and rose in the ranks of power and authority in Paris and in France, yes, it became quite a political and social battlefield. I think of the 1750s, for example, where the controversy over whether one should receive confession before death if one is suspected of being a Jansenist, you might think, well, that's just for the priest and the confessee, but no, Parliament gets involved in that battle. It goes all the way up to the court, to the king, to intervene, because the political side of this is who has the power? Does power rest in the church, or does power rest in the king? And Parliament sees themselves as defenders of the king, and the king's right. So they're not going to allow the church to take one of their own suspected of Jansenism and refuse him the last rites before death. They're not going to allow the church to do that. So, oh yeah, and then, the whole scuttlebutt over Port Royal, shutting it down, in 1709, that's very politicized between the nuns and sisters there and the Archbishop of Paris. Back and forth battles of words. Not to mention, once the ecclesiastical news hits the fan, that is an interesting newspaper to read, by the way. That is fascinating reading. And it lasts from 1728 to something like, 1820 or something like early 20th century. And I had access to that in Paris, and I was reading. It's only 4 pages per issue, but it's fascinating because they see the politics, the religious and political overlap, not only in France, but throughout Europe as well. So it's kind of giving you a global view of Jansenist battles in Italy and in Austria, Germany, France, Spain. That's a fascinating newspaper to read. If you can handle the French, it's lots of fun to read that newspaper.
And it seems like the destruction of Port Royal itself is a way of trying to erase this whole thing from the consciousness of the people.
And the king just about does it. Those of you who have been to Port Royal des Champs today know that there are 2 buildings left. That's it. A dovecote for the doves that they used to feed, and the Grange, the place where the solitaire, the men, used to live. And of course they turned that into a museum today. Every other building is gone, and even the graves were moved. The bodies, hundreds and hundreds of bodies over 150 years were moved so that there would be no place, no reason to create a pilgrimage site out of Port Royal des Champs. Now, Port Royal de Paris is still partly there. The city is encroached around it, of course. But the chapel is there. I've gone into the little chapel. But the buildings now are devoted to maternity ward, actually. Mothers that are about
I've been to Port Royal in Paris, and it shows a pilgrimage spot.
Oh, yeah.
Even on a Sunday afternoon, there's
Yeah.
crowds of
Yes.
people going in
Yes.
to see this place. And,
Yes. And Louis XIV did not want Port Royal des Champs to be the same thing. For one thing, it's too close to Versailles.
Yes,
Port Royal des Champs is not that many miles away from the Chateau de Versailles. And what a contrast in lifestyles between Port Royal des Champs and Versailles. And Louis XIV recognized that. Yeah. Your point is very well taken. And the farther you get into the 18th century with Jansenism, the more social and political conflict, and the less pure religious debate takes place. Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about the decline of Jansenism and the causes for that?
Okay. I think that's a natural bridge from what the gentleman just asked, because once Jansenism becomes enmeshed in politics and society and social debates, it becomes less pure. It therefore seems, in one sense of the word, less relevant, at least spiritually, religiously. Perhaps their attempt to be more relevant in their milieu, politically and socially, is part of what destroyed them in the end. And then it becomes more extremist as well. My final chapter here on the convulsionaires. The convulsionaires are in a sense, kissing cousins to the Jansenists, but the Jansenists didn't always want to own them as shirt-tail relatives. They are so bizarre. They get into crucifixions, they get into beatings, they get into some weird prophetic interpretations, figurism, dispensationalism, return of the Jews to the Holy Land, etc. And they just become more and more fringe. And I discovered in my research an embarrassing situation for one of the key philosophers of the Enlightenment at that time, when the convulsionaires are reaching their peak. Voltaire's older brother was a convulsionaire. 10 years older than Arouet de Voltaire was his brother. And his brother held convulsionist meetings in his own chateau, in his own home. That must have been terribly embarrassing for Rousseau. He never speaks of it. And then gradually, I would say, as the issues that led up to the French Revolution approached, and most of those issues were political, economic, and social injustice, Jansenism seemed irrelevant. It's like French history took a sharp left, and Jansenism continued heading right, and they just became less and less relevant. I stopped, as the book says, about 1799, because I was having a hard time finding any Jansenists anymore. By the time the French Revolution is over, I mean, there's tiny little pockets, little sects. A group meeting in this home and a group meeting in that home, but they're so scattered and so small and so insignificant that it's becoming more like the dodo bird of Catholicism, They're just extinct. They're extinct. So that's why I stopped. Now, in a certain sense, for those of you that are into teaching social history, cultural history, there's kind of a revival of the Jansenist memory in the 19th century, when there is kind of a pilgrimage taking place to Port Royal des Champs. There's annual little picnics there, little holidays, holy days celebrated, but it's all in memory of the golden age that is long past. And the writers that write during that Victorian era write with a very, I would use the word nostalgic tone. Oh, that was wonderful. Oh, that was the golden age. Oh, if we could just revive that sense of zeal and sacrifice and joy. Well, my study of Jansenism seems to show me, at least, that there never were any good old days. The good old days were pretty bad. They were full of persecution. But, this veneer, this sugar coating gets put over it in the 19th century, if they look back. Yes, ma'am?
First of all, I like the way you broke everything down here.
I guess that goes with my being a college teacher.
And I like the way things are put together. And I'm interested in Jansenism in the 17th and 18th century, but my question to you is a kind of, which I find very stimulating, picking up from some of the comments that were made here at the end of the line, and also your own experiences in various Protestant traditions. Are there any confessions living today, Protestant confessions, that owe something directly, not by coincidence, but something directly to the Jansenists? And I'm thinking how, at points of persecution, how many Jansenists, artists among them, fled to Holland, from France into Holland, and then from there, they may have migrated, into England and even across the Atlantic into the United States. Whether there are any, even genetic vestiges of a kind of Jansenist code that may have inspired, new religions.
That's an interesting question
Nothing about.
that would lead to probably speculation on my part more than reasoned answer, because like I say, I stopped in 1799. The first question you asked, I'm not aware of any ties between Jansenism and Protestantism. That would be an interesting
People that are
crossover.
going, moving out of France, going to Utrecht, going into
Yeah.
other parts of the Dutch Republic.
Yeah, where I'm coming from, yeah, they did that. Where I'm coming from, though, would be the idea of, a theological or ecclesiology crossing over from Jansenist, which a Protestant would see as Catholic, into a Protestant camp. Truly, as your question implies, there are religious groups based in Calvinism, for example, Presbyterianism and Congregationalism and the Dutch Reformed, that clearly have Augustinian bases in their theology, and that would make them somewhat similar to the Jansenists. But I'm not aware of any specific kind of crossover that would be recognizable in that sense. But when you use the word biological, genetic, I'm sure that probably some of those that came to South Carolina, for example, was a big area of settlement for French Huguenots and other French people. That well could be, and Canada, New France. Although under Louis XIV, he probably would not have wanted to send the Jansenists over here because they would just infect his colony in the New World, leave them in France and try to crush them over there. He would send his prostitutes to New France, but he wouldn't send his Jansenists to New France. They were forbidden. They were forbidden to come here. But yeah, there's no question at all that there would be probably some of Jansenist background coming with the French, particularly, in the 1680s, 1690s. Persecution on Jansenism is increasing, persecution on the Huguenots is increasing, persecution on the Camisards is increasing. So there'd be a lot of groups leaving France, yeah.
So thank you for coming, and thank you, Dr. Strayer, for a wonderful lecture.
Happy to be here.
Thank you. Appreciate it.